Agent Commie here. Donald Trump's electoral victory was perhaps a greater win still for the alt-left. The absurd and ersatz nature of the regressive left in the manner of Bill and Hillary Clinton has come in for intense scrutiny from across the political spectrum. The Bernie bros have lost this round, but may end up being in a better position to win the overall larger war. Part of why this is so is that the events of this election have given the alt-left a powerful legitimizing narrative. Even in the abodes of the regressive social justice warrior media, there seems to be some soul-searching in the wake of Trump's win. The Guardian, too frequently a megaphone for the likes of Jessica Valenti and Julie, all men are rapists and should be put in prison and then shot, Bindel, ran an essay by Thomas Frank. Donald Trump is moving to the White House and liberals put him there. Frank's recent bestseller, Listen, Liberal, gives an insincere Democratic Party machine the same kind of droll, sarcastic dressing down that his earlier classic, What's the Matter with Kansas, gives the Republicans. Frank's Guardian article is not even the tip of the iceberg. Former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, Robert Reich, answers the question of why the white working class abandoned the Democratic Party. From many sources, a narrative of the defeat of Hillary Clinton and the lost opportunities of the Obama administration is emerging. A narrative comparable in many ways to the cuck-servative meme that drove the alt-right. The idea that weak and effeminate mainstream conservatives have betrayed national interests by embracing social liberalism and sacrificing the West's European cultural heritage on the altar of immigration and multiculturalism. Trump's election has given the alt-left its own variation of the same theme. Weak and corrupt liberal and social democratic politicians, masking their sellout to neoliberal corporatism behind a mask of snobbish cultural liberalism, have betrayed the working class. This class treason takes several forms. 1. Running on reformist hope and change platforms to get Wall Street back on a leash, only to not do this once taking office and instead opting for anti-worker free trade deals, such as Bill Clinton's embrace of NAFTA or Barack Obama's support for the TPP. 2. Embracing mass immigration, despite its damaging effects on unemployment and wage levels, in order to build electoral constituencies, and then hide behind multiculturalism in order to preserve leftist cred and avoid scrutiny and accuse critics of such policies of being racist. 3. For the same reasons, promoting sexual and racial identity politics, which weaponize feminist and minority grievances as tools with which to shame and guilt lower-class white males into accepting reduced status, while simultaneously redirecting the anger of lower-class women and minorities against the white male working class, instead of against the rich and powerful institutions. This also causes the white male working class to see women and minorities instead of those same rich and powerful institutions as their enemies. Beneath the thin veneer of racial and sexual progressivism is a much darker and deeply regressive undercurrent of upper-middle-class smugness towards the unwashed masses. 4. Promoting visions of racial equality and feminist empowerment that are really just about consumerism and careerism in the corporate world. 5. Wasting activist vigor on silly and frivolous causes, such as safe spaces, trigger warnings, cultural appropriation, and privilege checking. This also makes the left objects of deserved ridicule in the eyes of the general public and makes the right seem more credible. The polarity has completely reversed from where it was 10 years ago, when intellectually vigorous liberals had a field day demolishing conservative foolishness, like hurricanes being God's punishment for allowing gay marriage, having creation science in the schools, and so on. And 6, affirming decidedly illiberal ideas, such as the censorship of offensive art and free speech, and legitimization of racial and sexual bigotry, government being in the bedrooms of the nation, so long as it's against acceptable targets, lower-class white males, and then proceeding to defend these illiberal ideas in decidedly fanatical, closed-minded, and morally overbearing ways. Naysayers are mansplaining, white-splaining, the voice of privilege, crying white male tears, not to mention no platforming, bannings from social media, getting people fired from their jobs, and so on. But the single most important point is that weak and corrupt liberal and social democratic politicians, masking their sellout to neoliberal corporatism behind a mask of snobbish cultural liberalism, have betrayed the working class. That's what matters. That's why white working class voters who would have gone for Bernie Sanders instead went for Donald Trump. That's the narrative the alt-left needs to seize, and they need to capitalize on the growing sympathy towards this narrative in social media. And that social media presence grows all the time. It needs to be communicated in short, quippy sound bites and internet memes. It needs to be repeated as often as possible up to the point of backlash, meaning don't beat people over the head with it. It needs to be repeated, along with a small handful of popular policy proposals that we could potentially have seen enacted come 2017 had Bernie Sanders won the election. Single-payer health care, a somewhat progressive income tax scheme, a living minimum wage, opposition to Citizens United, and similar kinds of ideas. And for the leftist identity politics types out there, friendly reminders of what someone like Sanders could have given them as well. Pay equity, defense of abortion and gay marriage rights, an end to the drug war, an end to prison privatization, and don't pass up a chance to remind them that it was the Clinton presidency that buried the Americans underneath a ton of regressive bullshit, and it was enabled for the most part by Senator Hillary Clinton, let's not forget her voting record, and doubled down on by President Obama. It's quite important that it be emphasized that the secret to defeating Trump in 2020 is setting aside identity politics and building a broad coalition that keeps its eyes on the real prize. This needs to be imparted by political activists who eschew corporate donations and fundraise primarily through individual small donors where possible, and these activists need to routinely call out political opponents who are on the corporate payroll. We need to learn from the success of the alt-right and the Trump presidential campaign that the medium is the message, depending on the forum. Don't bore people online with reams of policy when an internet meme says it all, in a way that gets you all laughing at lame politicians with sharp, to-the-point insults like cuckservative or crooked Hillary. I've long been of the opinion that the political left really needs to think long and hard about its relationship with academia. Leftism is at its best when it's from the streets, when it's about genuinely marginalized people making themselves heard and gaining their rights through collective political action. When the AFL-CIO organized in the 1930s and 40s, when civil rights were gradually acquired in the 50s and 60s. When second-wave feminism, whatever its flaws, emerged in the 70s, though by then the forces that were making leftism toxic were beginning to show themselves. The intellectual leadership kept the whole thing organized, but there were no academic egos involved in making these movements all about them personally and their careers. I have no quarrel with academics who are leftists. I know some and even have some in my family. But critical theory and postmodern philosophy is bad leftism and it's bad academia. Its continued existence in the ivory tower needs to be openly questioned. It's ultimately why American colleges have become the laughing stocks of social media, with cry-ins over Trump's electoral victory, safe spaces, and trigger warnings. Not that the likes of, say, Herbert Marcuse or Simone de Beauvais advocated those things, but their ideas began moving things in those directions. This is where abhorrent dogmas such as privilege theory and prejudice plus power first gained traction, and were then advanced with the certitude of the religious fanatic. We need to get rid of it. Political leftism thereby shifted from being about democratizing mass movements to being about high-browed secular clergy, made certain of itself by credentializing its own ideologies, policing the language, opinions, and manners of the unwashed masses. It became dictatorial, elitist, and focused on culture instead of economy, everything that leftism is not and should not be.
Because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism, the idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation.
That stuff is garbage. Smug rationalizations for self-serving double standards favoring the pseudo-leftist elect. We need to get this crap out of academia. End of story. In the late 80s and early 90s, just as places like Poland and Czechoslovakia were moving away from this repressive atmosphere of agree with accepted dogmas on the party line on all things or else face loss of reputation, job loss, or even legal repercussions, the tall foreheads in the West somehow decided that this would be the best way to achieve social equality over here. And I'm not talking about remaining silent in the face of real bigotry or not raising counter-arguments against regressive ideals. I'm talking about an ongoing atmosphere of perpetual moral outrage which makes the expression of legitimate views a socially risky endeavor. When you're hearing about violence against voters of either Trump or Clinton, friendships and marriages ending and jobs being lost over the manner in which citizens use their voting franchise, the right that generations past went to war to preserve and marched in the streets to win, you have a serious problem. And regressive forces like the alt-right are cashing in on it. They are taking advantage of people's legitimate resentment of emotional blackmail. They are growing because they are stealing progressive issues like freedom of speech and making themselves the hip and edgy voices of rebellion against the square liberal establishment. In what parallel universe does this happen? We have to know that if the alt-right ever came to real power, they would not uphold classical liberal values. They are fascists, after all. If liberal values such as civil liberties and racial and gender equality are to survive, liberals and leftists are going to have to stop relying on this stigmatizing of rival views, and instead be unafraid and unapologetic in the advance of their own world views. We are going to have to stop acting like we are owed allegiance and sympathy from people because of arrogant and self-serving prejudice plus power rationalizations and emotional blackmail, and start respecting the people enough to accept responsibility for winning them to our side through rational appeals to the better angels of our collective nature. Oh, and did I mention that Donald Trump won the White House because of weak and corrupt liberal and social democratic politicians, masking their sellout to neoliberal corporatism behind a mask of snobbish cultural liberalism and have betrayed the working class. I thought I did, but I thought I'd mention it again, and so should you. This has been Agent Tommy, over and out.